going to look at a presentation that I did while I was in the Philippines just a few days ago. And you'll hear me coughing and clearing my throat because I picked up a lung infection while I was over in the Philippines. And I'm trying to get over that and figure out how to get rid of it as a result of just doing all the natural things, like, for example, honey and water and lemon. So that plus, sleeping as much as possible, which is difficult because that was 12 hours in a time change, and I'm still trying to wrestle through that. Last night was not the easiest sleep I got, but, hot and cold or different foods, different mullein tea and stuff like that. We're doing all kinds of different things. So yes, I've got oregano oil. We've got lots of those things. So yeah, thank you all for your suggestions as well. And I haven't put it on my chest, but I'll do that. So thank you for your continued prayers and everything. But what we've got is, there is a presentation today that I'm going to give, and it's called Daniel Made Easy. It is the book of Daniel in an overview, and I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. And so if in fact you are interested in the book of Daniel, if it's something that you have listened to or studied, read several times in your history, you should be able to put this into your head and see the compilation that I've put together that shouldn't take too long, actually. I was sharing with my family just last night, and it took so short of a time that I added some things because I figured we could make it a little more involved than just the basics. But so to get going, we've already prayed together, and I'm going to start sharing this idea of what's happening in the book of Daniel. So notice, as we're looking at the book of Daniel, I've got what you could call a candelabrum, right? The menorah. And so there's the 7 branches here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can see that with my mouse jumping back and forth. And the first thought would be, well, chapter 1 is the center point right there in the middle where you're going to be able to see the rest of the branches are able to stem from. Now, why would that be? Well, chapter 1 actually has quite a significant part of Daniel's life. That's a setting for his experience in Babylon. In chapter 1, he feared God. He truly was a representative that, as the song we sang this morning, he stood up for Jesus, right? Stand up for Jesus. Well, he didn't know Jesus in name, but he knew that the Son of God was there, and also the Father had a son. That's why he was able to share with Nebuchadnezzar that ideology. And so, looking at this idea of chapter 1, you'd have to ask, like, what's the deal? Why is it number 1? Well, we're going to look at that in a moment. Chapter 2 and 7 also have a significance in that they relate. How does 2 relate with 7? And then how does 3 relate with 6? And how would 4 relate with 5? So this is the way I'm trying to lay out the book of Daniel. Chapter 1 being the center point of the candelabrum, and chapter 2 and 7 uniting, 3 and 6 uniting, 4 and 5. So basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If you can visualize that, it should be quite easy. And so that's why I'm trying to make Daniel easy, right? The book of Daniel made easy. So looking at the section of the Daniel in chapter 1 and then the 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, we're going to see how that relates and what it means in regard to looking at the book of Daniel. These are representing each chapter, by the way. Seeing chapter 1, you would wonder, like, why is it that 1 is there in the middle? Well, as I said before, 1 Corinthians 10:31 gives a good explanation of Daniel chapter 1. Whether therefore you eat or drink or whatsoever you do all to the glory of God. And that would be the summation of chapter 1, which, by the way, leads you to understand better the first part of the first angel's message. So now, why would 2 and 7 be part of this connection with the candelabrum there? Well, you can see that if basically this is what I did. In the next sections, 2 and 7, 3 and 6, 4 and 5, I've been able to just take 4 basic ideas of those chapters and see that they each relate in at least 4 different ways. And so if you can come up with more, that would be helpful, I'm sure. But looking at this, they both are visions, right? A vision of a statue with 4 different metals. This is a vision of 4 different beasts or animals, right? And so these are both prophecies. You have a prophecy here illustrated by the metals, prophecy here illustrated by the 4 beasts or animals. They both are starting in Babylon, and they lead to the second coming of Jesus, right? You can see that in chapter 2, you can see that in chapter 7. They both illustrate 4 world kingdoms in their prophecies, and it's really the 4 same kingdoms: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And so that's where I would be able to connect chapter 2 with all the way down here to chapter 7, right? So what about chapters 3 and 6? Well, chapter 3 and 6 have similarities in that this one is Daniel's 3 friends in the lion's den, if you remember that. And then this one, in the fiery furnace. And this one is Daniel in the lion's den. So Daniel's 3 friends in the fiery furnace, Daniel in the lion's den. And these chapters, they both are focusing on worship. The remnant, and we know that, there was the worship before that golden image, which was a mock of the previous image made of 4 metals. And so then over here, it was about worship in that they all needed to worship the one man at their head. So there was a remnant involved in both of them. This is the 3 compared to the many, even coming from Israel, unfortunately. And this was the 1 out of the 122 other princes and presidents. So you have the remnant or the minority being in each one. There's persecution against both. These were thrown into the fiery furnace. This one was thrown into the den of lions. And there was miraculous deliverance out of both of them. Okay? Now, looking at chapters 4 and 5, how would those be united? Well, this is Nebuchadnezzar and the vision of the big tree that covered the earth. And this one here is the story of Belshazzar, who's drinking the wine before his many leaders. So how would those relate? Well, it's a story of rulers in Nebuchadnezzar's story and Belshazzar's story, right? The straight testimony by Daniel the prophet was given to Nebuchadnezzar and was given to Belshazzar. The reactions of both rulers were recorded in both of them. This one accepted the message, and this one rejected the message. And the results of their reactions were recorded as well for the benefit of you and me. King Nebuchadnezzar was able to be reinstated on the throne, whereas this king didn't have such a good job there. He actually lost his kingdom to Darius, right, in chapter 6. So that's the real basic understanding of the book of Daniel. Chapter 1 is the strength that gave Daniel the ability to live through chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So each of these seem to have a relation if you're looking at it that way, and I think it makes a lot of good sense. So now, if you take away chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and all the other stuff, and you're looking at chapter 7, you're wondering, okay, why would I include 7 in there? Because if you recall, Daniel is laid out in chapters 1 through 6 in more of a history, and there's stories involved. It seems that chapters 7 through 12 are dealing with prophecy. So it's like the first half of Daniel is history, the next half is prophecy. Why would 7 be included in chapters 1 through 6? Well, I think it's because it's more of a transition chapter. Here's what I mean. If you go and look at what's being said there, chapter 7 verses 8 through 14 you're going to see the little horn is mentioned, the judgment is mentioned, and the kingdom is mentioned. I'm actually going to see those verses right now. Daniel 7 verse 8, another little horn. Daniel 7 verse 9, the judgment was set and the books were opened. 7 verse 14, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom. So in that order, in Daniel chapter 7 verses 8 through 14, you can see the little horn, judgment, and kingdom. And then what happens is, if you're understanding that in that section of Daniel chapter 7, it's dealing with this, you can go to the next section, which is 7:21 through 22, and you'll find the same exact order of the same exact things. So the little horn, judgment, and kingdom is what's dealt with in 7:21 and 22. So notice what 7:21 and 22 says. The same horn made war with the saints. Judgment was given to the saints in the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. So there again, the same horn, which is that little horn of verse 8, he comes, and then judgment and the kingdom. So again, the same thing, little horn, judgment, and kingdom. I find it fascinating that there's 2 times in Daniel chapter 7 that it goes over that same exact order of little horn, judgment, and kingdom. But we're not done yet, because in chapter 7 verses 24 through 26, the same identical thing happens. The little horn, the judgment, and the kingdom. And we'll find it here in 24. It says, another shall rise after them. Them being the 10 horns. And another horn is what would rise after them. So that's the little horn. But the judgment shall sit in verse 26, and then in verse 27, and the kingdom. So, you have in this section of Daniel the strength that Daniel had in fearing God and giving glory to Him, which would bring him through all of the different chapters, which seem to relate up to chapter 7. Then you have chapter 7, and you're wondering, like, okay, well, what's after 7? Because so far 7, if it's a transition section that goes little horn, judgment, and kingdom, little horn, judgment, and kingdom, little horn, judgment, and kingdom, what about the rest of the chapters, chapter 8 through 12? And that's what we're going to look at now. And so here, 8 through 9, and 10 through 12. Why would you suppose that I would put that set of numbers up there? Could it be that Daniel chapter 8 is a section of the prophecy that deals with something? Chapter 8 and 9 is another section of the prophecy that deals with something. And then chapters 10 through 12 is another section of the prophecies that deal with something. Well, what if it was as simple as chapter 8 deals with the little horn? You can know that if you're a Bible student, you go and just find that the little horn is focused on in chapter 8, and there's this big to-do about the little horn, so much so that Daniel was overwhelmed at the fact that he would be doing so much damage for so long that he passed out and wasn't able to even to hear the explanation of that 2300 days that was mentioned, because he was just like overwhelmed with this little horn, right? So looking further at this section, the little horn is being dealt with in chapter 8. What do you suppose would be dealt with in chapter 8 through 9? Well, remember the 2300 days is connected to chapter 9, with that first part being cut off, and then there's 70 weeks left, and there's the whole, experience of the 1810 years left over, and that is dealing with judgment. So the little horn is in chapter 8, judgment is in chapter 8 and 9. What do you suppose is being dealt with in chapters 10 through 12? Well, of course, the kingdoms, or kingdom. Now, it's kingdom singular because all the kingdoms of the world, focusing definitely in chapter 10, is Medo-Persia, and then chapter 11, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and then chapter 12 is dealing with at least in part, the final kingdom. And that's where I'm going to show you in this last verse that we're going to look at. Kingdom, Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. At that time shall Michael, which is, we know, the prince of the kingdom, Michael shall stand up that great prince, which stands for the children of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. We're going to be delivered from what? From where? Well, frankly, we're going to be delivered from the kingdoms of this world and brought into the everlasting kingdom of God. You see? So, little horn, judgment, and kingdom. That's what we see in Daniel chapter 7 3 times, and that's what we see laid out in Daniel chapters 8 through 12. So for me, that makes a lot of sense. And so looking at this idea of Daniel, if you wanted to just visualize it real quick, you have chapter 1 right there as kind of the foundation of fearing God and giving glory to Him, which would enable Daniel to make it through chapter 2, which relates with chapter 7, make it through chapter 3, his buddies would anyways, which proves that he could too in chapter 6. This is, by the way, worship that you must do, and this is a prohibition of the free exercise thereof. This here is number 4 in relation to number 5, in that there's 2 kings that basically go through a very similar experience with different reactions, and then the little horn, the judgment, and the kingdom. So for me, that is Daniel made easy. I find, to me, it makes a lot of sense. It's able to, for me, I'm able to put my mind around something like that. Just some visuals, a couple of numbers, and then the rest of it is the stories that you're able to know and understand if you have gone through the book of Daniel a number of times. If you haven't, then that's your homework. I encourage you to go through the book of Daniel, try to understand what it is that it's saying and also what it's not saying, and then do your duty to try to understand the prophecies as well. The prophecies of Daniel are amazing. The better you know the book itself, the better you'll be familiar with the prophecies once you understand them. Because you'll be able to see, like, wait a minute, that's just very similar to Daniel chapter 2. And that's what happens in 7. But why is it happening again in 8? And why? And so by the time you're done understanding what's happening with the book itself, then the prophecies will make better sense. So if you haven't gone through the book of Daniel recently, please do so and find that it can be made simple.